event. This says Kara for my grandfather, for Zaidi, Paltiel ben Shmuel Yitzchok Hamachuna, also known as Paul Sperling. Thank you very much for coming on a Sunday. There's several people who are going to speak and tell their remembrances. And in a way, the ultimate nechama, there's a mazel tov because my brother Simi is not here because he had a baby boy this morning or last night. So that in its own sense is the ultimate nechama. The first person who's going to be speaking is Aunt Rochelle, again, my father's sister, who was very close to Zaidi, obviously, as his daughter.
Okay. 2 weeks ago, I was thinking about my father's patira, and I had this feeling that he just disappeared. In reality, I expected him to live until he was 105. I had spoken to him several times on Thursday, and then on Friday, I received the phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning from his aide, June, telling me that he was unable to wake my father up. As it was Erev Pesach, there was no funeral. I think I sat Shiva the longest of any of us, and that was a total of 3.5 hours. And to make everything a bit stranger, about 10 days ago, I looked at my recent phone calls on my cell phone, and I see one from Daddy. Obviously, it was probably one of the workers up at Fountain View checking the apartment after we had cleaned it, and he called from Daddy's apartment. However, I tend to think that maybe it was Daddy telling us that he is fine, he is sitting with Mommy and watching over all of us. We all surmise that Daddy wanted to make this as easy for us as possible. In addition, he would never want anyone to talk about him or his unbelievable accomplishments for 7 days. But Daddy did not get off scot-free, as we are here today to talk about our father, his love for his family and for Hashem, and the many lessons that he has taught us. We are all familiar with the words of Shema as we recite them 3 times a day. We are told to love Hashem with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your resources. I think this aptly describes our father. He was a true Eved Hashem who possessed the ultimate Simchas HaChayim. Every mitzvah was important to him. Even at the age of 100, he would get up each morning at 5 o'clock a.m. and say his 10 parakim of Tehillim. Then at 7:30, Rabbi Hauer would call so he could learn Daf Yomi with his Baltimore Chevra, which he loved. At 8:10, he would inform Rabbi Hauer that he had to get ready to go to shul for Shacharis. Shacharis started at 8:30, at which time he would attempt to turn around and he would ask, "Where is the rabbi?" It is 8:30 and it's time to start davening. About a year ago, my father asked me if I could bring him a roll of quarters. I was curious as he had no need for money in the apartment, as everything was provided at the Fountain View. When I asked why he needed a roll of quarters, he said that he felt bad that he had no quarters for the pushka, and he really needed to give tzedakah every day. 2 weeks ago, we spent the Shabbos at Fountain View for the Shloshim. At that time, Rabbi Seplowitz was remarking that they were having a little more difficult time getting a minyan. He said that when my father was alive, he knew he only needed 9 for a minyan, as my father was always there. And Rabbi Seplowitz also remarked that he felt that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew how important a minyan was to my father, and Hashem made an extra effort to direct men to the shul to make the minyan. If we continue reading the Shema, we are told, "Teach the commandments thoroughly to your children and speak of them while you sit in your home, while you walk on the way, when you retire at night and arise in the morning." My father's life evolved around Torah, around the mitzvahs, and around shul. Speaking of shul, my father was in charge of the minyanaires at Ohev Shalom Talmud Torah for many, many years. In fact, I believe he was the sole Mr. Minyanaire. Every Sunday morning, he would have a minyan at the shul with the boys, I guess from the ages of about 8 to 15. They would daven, he would check to make sure they were wearing their tzitzis. He would teach them how to daven from the amen and how to lane. He would emphasize the importance of davening with the minyan, and then they would have breakfast, bagels of course, and do a fun thing. Go to a ball game, have a speaker, and the such. When my father celebrated his 100th birthday, he received many letters from his millionaire boys. I would like to read to you a couple of snippets from some of these letters. Dear Mr. Sperling, It has been 50 years since I was a regular member of the Ohev Shalom Talmud Torah Sunday Millionaires. I don't think I thanked you, the legendary Mr. Sperling, for all of your kindness, dedication, and trouble. I certainly should have long ago. I should have thanked you, Mr. Sperling, for always being there for us crazy, wild, ungrateful kids. I should have thanked you for giving Torah an attractive, exciting, and holistic face. It was a Torah that was all-encompassing, including tefillah, eating, ball games, social interaction, the game room, fun, a Torah full of life, love, and vitality. And from another Millionaire graduate, there is much that a seasoned educator can learn from you. You had a personal relationship with each kid without making a big deal out of it. It was our opportunity to get involved in shul and to feel a part of it. To this day, I read the Torah every Shabbos, and I got my start at the Youth Minyan. Who could imagine preteens and teens running to shul on a Sunday morning? And one of my favorites, Shalom, Mr. Sperling. I am glad to see that our antics at the Millionaires apparently did not take years off your life. I consider it a privilege to have known you while growing up at Ohev Shalom, and I think that your conduct bein Adam l'chaveiro was a model to be emulated. The lesson in all these testimonials is that everyone can and should attempt to inspire and educate. The most important element in my father's life was his family. He loved his wife and his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and was so proud that he had 3 great-great-granddaughters. My mother and father spent 72 beautiful years together. They were both of the same mind, being active participants in the yeshivas that we attended, the shul, and any organization needing their help, doing what they considered was their duty as members of the community. When my mother was so very sick and in the nursing home in Muncie, my father, at the age of 97, would take the van every day and sit by her bed. When he suffered a stroke almost 3 years ago, we tried to convince him to go for rehab in a facility near our home in Queens. But his concern was, what will be with Mommy? Would they be able to transfer her to Queens? That was not a possibility, so he told us in no uncertain terms that he would not come to Queens, but would stay in Mommy in the same rehab nursing home as my mother. As you all probably know, Daddy was a lot of fun. Everyone loved going in his car when he drove carpool. In fact, last week I went to pay a shiva call at the Goldfeder's home, and Shalom the son said to me, I loved it when your father drove carpool. If we encountered any traffic, he told us not to worry, as he would go into scat gear, thereby flying over the traffic. He entertained many a child at birthday parties, wearing a cape and holding a wand, and removing his ring from a child's ear. We would sit mesmerized as he told us a whole series of Slim, Shorty, and Fatso stories of his own imagination. Friday nights after dinner, we would engage in spelling bees and math bees until he fell asleep. I can't remember my father ever disciplining us, and that was not because my brothers were such angels. It was a task he left to my mother. We all had a wonderful childhood given to us by our parents. We have much to be thankful for. My father had a long life filled with good health and many happy days. He taught us how important it is to love a spouse and how to cherish one's children and one's future generations. He taught us the essence of Amunah, belief in Hashem, and reverence for and love of Torah. Although we are not in Muncie right now, I have to thank Fountain View for all their efforts on our behalf. Daddy had spent the last 4.5 years there, the facility being beautiful and the staff was wonderful. Every Jewish community has an obligation to have such a facility to take care of the elderly in their midst. And we have to give a special thank you to my father's aides, Raul and June, who took such good care of him. I just want to end with a thank you to my family, my children and their families, for loving to visit with my father. It was never a chore for them. Adiva Leah lived in Muncie and was able to go over to my father for short visits and when he needed her. Binyamin spent many Shabbosos with Daddy, sleeping on the couch and singing Zmiros with him. Efrona had a weekly date with her Zadie, who called her his baby doll, and she loved every minute of it. Atara lives a continent away, but the past 2 summers she worked at Hask in the mountains and was able to visit frequently and spend Shabbos with him. And a special thank you to my husband David, who never balked at going up to Fountain View for a Shabbos or Yontif, even if it meant being able to take a 4-hour nap on Shabbos afternoon. And thank you to everyone who has come out this afternoon to honor and learn from the life of our father. Thank you.
Next, my father, Avimori, Lenny Sperling.
Basically, I think Rochelle said it all, and I'm going to be somewhat brief. There's a pasuk in Koheles which says, right at the beginning, Dor holech v'dor ba, and v'chulu, and then the next pasuk says, V'zarach hashemesh u'ba hashemesh. The sun rises, the sun sets. A generation goes, and a generation comes. As Rochelle said, I'm happy to report that my youngest son, Simi, Mayor Simcha, and his wife Yael had a little boy this morning at 6 o'clock. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to give a kavod achron to my father, Olav Hashem. Since it is within 30 days of Shavuos, Hespedim are prohibited. Therefore, I am going to speak about him and what we can learn from his life. We take things for granted, but we really shouldn't. Miriam and I try to go to Muncie for Shabbos, either bi-weekly or every other third Shabbos. He appreciated it so much when a member of his family was with him for Yontif or for Shabbos. When we were there, Shabbos HaGadol, which was the Shabbos preceding his death, we left Saturday night, taking for granted that we would see him again in a few weeks, just as we had done for many, many years. Little did we know that that would be the last time. I had an inkling that Shabbos that something was out of the ordinary. My father seemed to be preoccupied and was weak, but I figured that a person who's 100 years old, you don't have to pay too much attention to that. He would go to the doctor to clarify his health situations, which he did. But I noticed that he was having certain difficulties. He was having problems with his right hand, which was the good hand, and he lost his sense of humor. To give you an idea of what happened on Shabbos, Friday night and Shabbos, he would drink a cup of schnapps in honor of the Shabbos or the Yontif. He was holding the cup, and because of the weakness in his hand, it dropped on his pants. So I told him, you know, Dad, now your pants are worth $45 more than they were before. He didn't react. He didn't laugh, he didn't smile, nothing. And I don't think it was because he lost a cup of Canadian Mist. Now that my father is gone, all of this is past memory. Even lately, he could remember his family history in detail, as well as personal and events which occurred in his youth. And he did a pretty good job of it. Now we will have to supplement his life through memory, pictures, and that which is documented. At his 100th birthday party, which was a big hit in November or December, a slideshow was presented depicting his life, and I'm sure we will review it over and over again. Just to tell you about this birthday party, I asked him after the party, well, Dad, how did you like the party? He says, well, at least there was a minyan for mincha. Many calls and letters were received over the last 6 weeks with information about my father, which I never knew. Stories, events, involvement with individuals, community, and of course the shuls in which he was involved. Normally, when you sit Shiva, all of these stories are told back and forth for 7 days. However, we did not have Shiva in this case because He was buried on Erev Pesach, and halacha took over. The Jewish law took over. And that was really a bigger schus for him than us hearing about his personality during the Shiva period. When my parents lived in D.C., he was a gabbai at Hohef Shalom Talmud Torah, Rabbi Klavan Shul, and it pained him greatly if there was no minyan, which my sister has spoken about. At 6:15 a.m., he would call people, wake them up, telling them, "This is God calling, we need a minyan." And it worked. The shul began declining, and he always worried about it, which in turn had an effect on my mother. So at our persuasion and on the pretext that they were getting older and they needed to be near children, they decided to move to Baltimore to a condo a few blocks from us. This move was made in heaven. Right next door was the Shari Zion Shul, this shul, with Rabbi Moshe Hauer, who's present as the Rav. The shidduch between my parents and Rabbi Hauer was immediate. They appreciated his compassion, attention, and understanding that Rabbi Hauer gave to them, and we thank him so much for that. My father attended his daf yomi 7 days a week, as well as other shiurim, as well as coming to the shul here morning and evening. Not long after joining Shari Zion, my father became a gabbai again, but this time it was more than what he had in Washington, and he became what's referred to as a respected macher. Because Shari Zion had an attendance much greater than Oev Shalom, and his job, therefore, was much more complicated. His responsibilities were more complicated. In addition to unlocking the shul, the Oren Kodesh, collecting tzedakah, and the timekeeper. Heaven forbid if they started 1 minute late. And I'm going to tell you a little secret right now that I heard at that time, that at my mother's request, my father wanted to quit because he thought the gabos was too much. And this is what he told me. And he used to tell me everything because I used to pick him up at 6 o'clock in the morning and take him to shul because he broke his leg, which we'll talk about in a minute. But, and he used to tell me everything that was going on and everybody who called him. But when he told me that he was going to speak to Rabbi Hauer about resigning from the gabos, I didn't think that was a good thing. So I called Rabbi Hauer, without his knowledge, and asked him to please deny my father's request. He told him at this time, when my father went to see him, that his request was denied. And several days later, my father told me very proudly that he spoke to Rabbi Hauer about resigning, but the request was denied for now. And at this time, I really want to take an opportunity to thank the Daf Yomi Chabura, which my father attended when he was here, and which he attended on the telephone for 5 years when he was in Muncie, for their patience and understanding, even during difficult times. Normally, the way it works is that a yeshiva bacher stays in the yeshiva for years and years, and then he goes out into the field to make a living. My father was different. First, he was a businessman, and then he became a yeshiva bacher. When he was in D.C., he participated in Daf Yomi. He learned Chumash Ramban with Mr. Ernest Friedman, his closest friend for most of his life. Finished Shas several times. And at the same time, they came to Baltimore, and they came to Baltimore together. And I'd like to thank Mr. Friedman for the impression he made on my father and the influence he made on him, including rubbing off onto my father some of his Hungarian minhagim, or customs. My father had a tremendous respect for Torah, v'lom deha, and to him, kviyas b'Torah, setting and keeping designated times for learning, was utmost importance. I remember on January 1st, 2009, he went to Reisterstown Plaza and was hit by a car, a hit and run. He was taken to Sinai Hospital by ambulance with a broken leg and required surgery. He was in the hospital for recuperation and physical therapy, etc. And at his request, I used to go every day between 6 and 6:30 in the morning to help him with his talis and tefillin. And by 7:30, he was ready with his Gemara and his telephone for Rabbi Hauer's shiur. Nothing got in the way. Breakfast and coffee was wheeled in, but that had to go to the side until he was finished. The doctors and nurses knew that you don't go into that room until the daf yomi was complete, and that was between 7:30 and 8:30. Even, as you all know, there are hospital rounds. The hospital rounds had to stay away and postpone their visit until the daf yomi was over. Then, in 2010, he and my mother moved to Muncie, and he stayed on the phone every day with Rabbi Hauer on the daf yomi until the day he passed. He was always at the shiur, and he was at the shiur the day before he passed away. He participated in the shiur Thursday morning, and he passed away Thursday evening or Friday morning, Erev Pesach. He and my mother have a tremendous legacy, that there are 4 generations of Shomer Torah u'mitzvahs, all of them. My father was a big Baal Tzedakah, and more privately than publicly, which he learned from his father, Shmuel Yitzchak, Olav Shalom. My father always used to tell me a story. My grandfather, Shmuel Yitzchak, owned the Sperling department store in Washington, D.C. on 4th and G Street. And the Meshulachim used to come in all the time. One day, a Meshulach came in, and either he wanted an extraordinary amount of money, or my grandfather didn't have it, whatever it was, and my grandfather got scared because he couldn't do the mitzvah of tzedakah the way he should. Then my grandfather called Rabbi Yoshua Klavin, Zatzal, to come over because he didn't know what to do. So Rabbi Yoshua Klavin came over and heard the story. He threw the Meshulach out of the store and told him never to come to town again. My father was also a very dedicated husband, as my sister said. After my mother had numerous strokes, he was always at her bedside, and then when she had a very severe stroke, which put her on a trach, he was in Friedwald with a stroke, so she was on one side of the hall and she was on the other. And he would always be wheeled into her room to visit her and to stay with her. This was his life, and this is the lesson to us. I'd like to thank my wife Miriam. I'd like to thank Rochelle and David, my sister and brother-in-law, Michael and Marlene, my brother and sister-in-law, for everything they have done for her over the past 15 years. I'd also like to thank Adiva Leah Pomerantz, my niece, who lived in Muncie and who was always at Fountain View, the assisted living where my father was, to give a hand with whatever she could do. And lastly, I want to thank her husband, Shlomo, because that Friday, which was Erev Pesach, it was almost impossible to work with a Chevra Kadisha. However, as he said, when you call the fire department, they come right away. And he, through his efforts, the Chevra Kadisha came right away, even though it was Erev Pesach, and the Kavura was right away in Baltimore, and we should all meet at Simchas, and I would wish everybody a good Yontif.
Thank you. Next up is Uncle Michael, father's brother.
Well, my brother and sister have taken all the stories, so I really am going to be brief and a little more abstract, I think. So in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot, we read a saying of Ben Bagbag, who said, 100-year-old is as one who has died and passed away and has been negated from the world. Well, Ben Bagbag may have been correct in general, but he was certainly not correct in the case of my father. Well past his 100th birthday, I saw my father connect with all types of people, young people, older people in Shul, other residents of Fountain View, his aides, and visitors. My father played a central role at his own 100th birthday party, and people would delight in conversing with him. This followed a pattern that I saw over the years, that Dad was able to connect with all kinds of different people throughout his life. He certainly had a special connection with children, as we've heard, and with his Orthodox contemporaries, but he was also able to establish an emotional bond with all kinds of both Jews and non-Jews, and inspired a range of emotions that ranged from mutual self-respect to love in these relationships. I remember observing the respect he elicited in his employees, the concern other residents of the apartment building in Baltimore exhibited for him, and the admiration that bordered on love that he inspired in the various aides that cared for my mother and father in the last years of their lives. I've often thought about what the character trait was that gave him the ability to relate so positively to all these different kinds of people. I think I can best express my conclusion with a metaphor for my work. In computer interface design, we have a principle called WYSIWYG, which of course stands for the well-known phrase, "What you see is what you get." In interface design, this means that the user interface should directly reflect the inner workings of the computer program, so that the interface transparently presents to the user what the program is trying to do. I think this term WYSIWYG can describe Dad as well, and perhaps helps explain why people related so well to him. When Dad spoke, you knew that he meant what he said. His words conveyed his inner feelings rather than what he thought the other person wanted to hear. He could be silent if there was nothing good to be said, but I never got the feeling that he would say something that he did not truly believe. As an example, when we asked him why he stayed religious, why so many others he grew up with did not stay religious, he could have answered with an intellectual discussion or even a blanket statement of faith. But instead, he simply said that he really enjoyed the lifestyle that came with being religious. His speech was a true reflection of his thoughts and offered a transparent path to his core, and people instinctively knew that. But transparency is only as good as what it reveals. I saw, and I think others saw, a really unique kind of inner goodness. What made this goodness so special is that it was achieved not by rejecting the pleasure and joy of the world that is available in life, but by embracing the world and its possibilities. Dad's tales of hijinks in his youth, his ready laugh, his joy in sharing a drink, his strong opinions about various sports teams, Deadskins, for those who know about that, were all evidence that being a good man did not require giving up the richness of life. So he had this inner core of goodness, and he had this transparent window to his inner core. I think it was this combination that endeared him to everybody he came into contact with. Finally, allow me a little theological speculation as a conclusion. When Yeshayahu says that Israel will be a light unto the nations, I would say he was not speaking of abstract ideas or even a single bright light representing Israel as a whole. Rather, it is a collection of people like Paul Sperling, each one with a small, pure light that shines transparently to the outside, that is the realization of Yeshayahu's ideal. I, of course, echo all the thanks that have been given to various people, all the individuals who helped with my father and my mother over the years. It's really been wonderful, all the help that people have given, both members of the family, not members of the family. They're the ones who really made his and my mother's last years really worth living. Thank you all for coming.
Representing all the grandchildren, this is my brother Tani.
I have to say that my father, uncle, and aunt are really a hard act to follow, so I will really try to be brief. They've stolen quite a bit of my thunder. I want to echo their sentiments and thank everybody who's come here today. Really, it's a tremendous simcha to honor him, to see people who came out on a Sunday afternoon really representing the entire gamut of his life, going from Washington all the way through his stay here in Baltimore and into Muncie. Your presence here today really shows your love and appreciation of a person we referred to as Zadie. Again, as was stated by my brother, I'm representing the grandchildren. Most of the great-grandchildren aren't here in the room because they couldn't keep quiet, but I'm here today representing the grandchildren. Really, today, to understand my grandfather, one has to just, it was the word love, the love that he showed for all of us. In trying to find a story that really encapsulated all of those ideals, I remember that my father alluded to it, and it was in January of 2008, I believe, it was 2009, one of the two. We were in the office one day, it was early January, and all of a sudden we got a call that my grandfather had been involved in an accident, that he was at the Reisterstown Road Plaza, and that he was hit by a pickup truck, and that he was in an ambulance, and that his condition was okay, but he was injured. So my father and I rushed over to Reisterstown Road Plaza, and the story came out that there was a closeout store, I forgot the name of it, and they were having a closeout sale on ketchup and deodorant, and my grandfather went to the store to go chaperine. And in the course of trying to bring some of the items over to his car, this pickup truck backed up and hit him. Baruch Hashem, he was in an ambulance. They told us his condition was okay. He was alert. He was injured his leg. They weren't sure of the extent of it, but that was the status. Okay, we were very worried, of course, about his condition. He was at the time 93 years old, okay, what was going to happen, etc. And I called the relatives to let everybody know what happened. And then all of a sudden, my cell phone rang. It was Zadie from inside the ambulance. What was the problem? Zadie, are you okay? He said, now at the time, my grandfather had a red Taurus that he got in Baltimore, and it was parked in the lot. And he said to me, he said, Tani, I want you to make sure that you go back and I'll give you the keys to the Taurus so you can bring it home. I said, okay, that's understandable. He said, no, not for the car, but I have deodorant and ketchup in the back, and I'm worried that it's going to get stolen. Okay, no problem, I'll take care of that. He called me probably 3 or 4 more times to remind me, so I went to the hospital to see him, and I got the keys from him, and he reminded me again. But I told him, I called him later, and I said, Zadie, I just want you to know, I brought your car home, but when I got there, a lot of the locals were opening the trunk, getting the ketchup and the deodorant out. He was very upset that I said that. How, not for the ketchup and the deodorant, but the fact that I would even joke that his ketchup and deodorant were gone. Why do I say that story? To Zadie, the ultimate hana in his life was not material things. As a grandchild, I can say firsthand the love and the caring that he exuded for every grandchild, for talked and could deal with every one of us, from the oldest to the youngest. My siblings and my first cousins will all attest to just the love he showed us. Of course, the granddaughters were showed more love than the grandsons. I don't know why. There were the loves in his life were really were Bobby was more than anything. The care he showed to her was so evident whenever we would see them. He himself, he needed nothing. Bobby, of course, herself, it was the same midah. Bobby needed nothing. All she cared about was Zadie. Zadie only cared about Bobby. And to that was their whole lives were each other. And their children and their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. It was their entire lives. Zadie's other love in his life was the shul. The Doris we have here today, we have Rabbi Klavin and we have Rabbi Hauer, who represent decades and decades of edus, really, to testify about the caring, the love that Zadie had for the shul. And the shul to him represented the Mesorah of Klal Yisrael. This week we had Parshas Bamidbar, which discusses the Golim and the manner by which the Yidden traveled in the Midbar. And there was a pattern by which they traveled. And the Mefarshim ask a question, how did they know they traveled in this pattern when they actually left Mitzrayim? Yet if we know the chronological order of how things went, they didn't actually know that order until much later. How did they know? So I saw in a sefer, I don't remember which one, I'm sorry, but it says that when they stood around saying goodbye to Yaakov, their father, who was on his deathbed, Yaakov told them a specific order by which they would stand around his bed, and it was that order that they traveled in the Midbar. Really, it was the Mesorah, you see, that was so important to Yaakov and to my grandfather. To Zaidi, it was so important, the Mesorah. The love that he showed, the stories about the millionaires that my aunt talked about, my father, my uncle, it was really, those stories are all true. I have many people who come over to me today and tell me about the fact that they would not be Shomrei Torah mitzvahs, but for the fact that they attended the millionaires. They wouldn't know how to read a siddur or a chumash, forget about laning, which he taught them also, but that he wouldn't know those things, but for the fact that my grandfather took the time and the effort into them to teach them how these things. It was the Mesorah that he loved to transmit. When we would come to shul with him in Washington, as my father said, it wasn't such a large crowd at that time, but to my grandfather, it was so important. Everything about that was the Mesorah of everything that had to be taught, going down and down. And over here, when my grandfather came to Baltimore, so many people in Shari Zion came and said how my grandfather, he was one of the guys. That was the word I heard often, on and on, about he was one of the guys, how he was just everything about the shul was so important to him, and how he opened up the shul in the morning, and how all the shiurim were so important. But again, it was the family, in the family that each of us should know how much he cared about us and how much he was so important to us, that we should know how important learning was, how important davening was, how important a shul was, how important it was to be part of a community, how to have respect for other people. And as my father said, the kavod of the rabbonos that he had was unbelievable. The word of a Rav to him was absolutely set in stone. It was golden. That was the word. And there was nothing else. And it was that which, as my father said, that to have Baruch Hashem generation, something which he in his, for my grandfather to see, Dorei Doros of Shomrei Torah mitzvahs, was something which it attests to his ratzon, his will, that's the way we should lead our lives. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming. I wish to thank my uncle, my aunt, my father for the tremendous care they took for my grandparents. It's certainly a lesson that I wish that my own family should see, and I'm sure they do see, that all of us should live by such an example. And it's certainly a kavod for them. Thank you for coming.
One of the things that all the speakers mentioned is the great kavod and great respect Bubby and Zaidi had for Rabbi Hauer. So, hear from Rabbi Hauer.
Thank you very much. There are lots of times when people thank rabbis for things which they did for them or for their family members, and lots of times you say you're welcome. There are some times when you say you got it all wrong. Thank you. Thank you. There's some times when you have somebody who comes and becomes a part of your kehillah, a couple that becomes a part of your kehillah, an individual that becomes a part of your kehillah, part of your community, where you say, where can I get more people like that? This is like a treasure. It has added so much, really, from day one. So this is not a thank you that I can accept, or that I think we in the Kehillah can accept, but it's actually one that we have to express, we have to say first. So I'm not going to tell you whether I'm going to speak short or I'm going to speak long. I'm just going to speak. And you'll all decide in the end that I spoke long. I'll think that I spoke short, and we'll have this little agreement. But what I would just like to do is, I would just like to quickly share 4 points. 4 points which, to me, here we are, we're celebrating the life of Rav Paltiel. I usually don't like that expression at the time of a funeral or of a loss. We had to come up with that formulation here because of the proximity to Shavuos. Doesn't matter, Mr. Sperling's death wasn't tragic. He had, Baruch Hashem, a full life and was zeichet to so much, was privileged to have so much. But it's still a tremendous loss. But we're not going to focus on the loss. We'll focus on what we have, on what we got from him. And I would like to, again, just share quickly 4 points. Yesterday in the Parsha, we read about the wonderful promises and the not-so-wonderful consequences, depending on our relationship to Hashem and His Word. And the expression which recurred in the Parsha, when it spoke about the not-so-good side, was V'im telchu imi bekeri. What does that expression mean? And Rashi brings as his first interpretation is that you go with me ba'arai, lifrakim. Ba'arai means temporarily, or lifrakim means seasonally, occasionally. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. If there was one thing that we all learned from Mr. Sperling, and it has been mentioned already, it is consistency. But not just consistency as a mindless notion of, I just do this, this is my routine. I think the consistency, the unique brand of consistency which Mr. Sperling exercised in his life was what he built his life around. You know, sometimes we struggle when we daven, and we daven 3 times a day, and sometimes we'll finish davening and we don't even remember whether we davened or not. It's hard to summon the kavanah, the proper thoughts, to focus. Lives are busy and full, and we wonder, what did we do? What did we accomplish? And the truth is that we accomplished still a great deal. Because even if we, so to speak, just went right through it, the fact that our days are punctuated by checking in with God, by praying, by recognizing this is going to be what's going to make the difference in our life, even if, so to speak, we sleep through the experience, but we're there, and that becomes the punctuation marks of our life, is a huge thing. Mr. Sperling was with us. He was with us for the Daf Yomi, literally, as was mentioned, until his last day. Until his last day. Thursday morning, he woke up for the Daf Yomi, and Friday morning, he did not wake up. It's an amazing thing. Over the last short period, you wondered sometimes whether he was exactly into it, especially somewhere around the second parak of Yevamis. You might have wondered that. Whether he was on it the same way, whether he understood it the same way. But you know what? In a certain sense, that wasn't the point. The point was that here was a man who lived, and the punctuation mark in his life was, the day starts with my Blat Gemara. It stops again for davening in the morning, for davening in the afternoon, for davening in the evening. That was what he built his life around. A second point. Mr. Sperling, Rav Paltiel, had tremendous instincts. He had a tremendous, what seemed to be a natural sense of, you've got to do the right thing. There are those who explain, Meir Simcha, the Meshech Chachma, explains that that's really the deeper meaning of Nasa v'Nishma, that we said we will do before we will hear. We don't need to hear. We'll know, we'll understand, we will intuit what the right thing is. And Rav Paltiel had a very refined, sharp sense of doing the right thing. It wasn't expressed offensively, it was expressed proudly. I remember more than once him telling me about the commitment to Shmiras Shabbos in business, without any shtick or heterim, which he had in his family and which he had encountered in life. This is the way you got to do it. A specific expression of it was in his punctuality. You're doing something, you got to be there on time. You got to make sure that you're there waiting for the davening. A specific expression of it was his sense of responsibility to community. The gabos, which it was good for him, it was great for everybody, but he just had a sense. He's here, he's got to make sure, do his part, which he did very well, to make sure that things are happening and going well and done right. That same sense of responsibility was an incredible sense of hakaras hatov, of appreciation. I think I mentioned it on the video for his 100th birthday. But this is the way it went. This is the way it went in the Daf Yomi Shir on the phone for the last 4 years. He had to be at Minyan at 8:30. Our Daf Yomi technically starts 7:35 or so, ends at around 8:15, unless it's a very long Blat Gemara. Many of you here had visited him in the Fountain View. If you hadn't, I would tell you, just as a point of reference, the walk from his room to shul was about the walk from here to the parking lot, more or less. It was not a long walk. In the beginning, at 8:15, he was off the phone. The last couple of years, it creeped up. Okay, it took him a little longer. By 8:07, sometimes 8:05, I've got to go. It wasn't because the shir was boring. It was because he was there and he says, I've got to be there on time. So he says, okay, I've got to go. Okay, Mr. Sperling, be well. Goodbye, have a good day. And I learned, sometimes I slipped and made a mistake and I hung up the phone. But it was always okay. Then we dangled there for a minute. He didn't always realize that there were, 10 people in the room. We dangled there for a few seconds. And then he said, and Yasher Koach. Yasher Koach. He never wanted to hang up without saying, thank you very much. It was beautiful. That's, we're called Yidden, Yehudim, because we say thank you, because we appreciate. And he wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't hang it up without expressing appreciation. On a rare occasion, the guys from the Shir know, on a rare occasion, I said, okay, Mr. Sperling, bye, have a good day. And we'd wait on the phone, and somehow the thank you didn't come, and we knew something was going on. Something was going on with an 8 or something like that. It was literally, you could bet on it. So, second thing, tremendous instinctive drive to do that which is right, to be responsible. The third thing was he was a man of profound emotion and feeling. Profound emotion and feeling. Sure, it was expressed even in shul. He davened, ehrlich. He davened very sincerely, very, very sincerely, every day. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. He put himself into it. He felt his love for his family, which was beautiful, for his wife, his dedication. It's been described. I'm not going to describe it again, but what I can describe and say, because every speaker to this point has been from the family, he and his wife succeeded in creating a family that loved each other. They led the way. They loved each other, they loved their kids, they loved their grandchildren, but the love which they got back, the dedication, he was in Muncie all the time having children and children-in-law coming for Shabbos, coming in and out. When they lived here, it was always, the door might as well have been left open or unlocked from the parade of Einaklach and so on, who were constantly there. A beautiful, beautiful thing. I'll always remember, I think, when Rav Yehuda Friedman, his dear friend, when his wife was nifteres, when she passed away. And I remember telling Mr. Sperling, it was mincha time, I think. I don't think it was shachris. I think it was mincha time. And he just was sitting and he was crying like a baby, crying for her, crying for his dear friend and his loss. It was shachris. I remember they came to see me before shachris. Now that I say it, I remember. But he just sat there and he was crying. It's beautiful, beautiful. No sense of having to hold back. Finally, he was geschmack. He was just a joy. He was just a wonderful, wonderful person to be around. Communities, families, every group of people, you have someone who's sort of like the center of the wheel that everybody just gravitates towards. They hold everything together. They're so beloved. They're really just a rallying point. His kibitzing, yes. His warmth, yes. His l'chaims, yes. One thing I couldn't learn from him, many people tried before and many people tried since to teach me how to drink. I don't know what to do. I never saw somebody take a drink like he took when there was a yahrzeit. And I would take, enough to barely cover the bottom of a schnapps glass. He would say, Rabbi, on that you make a bayre mine besomim. And it was ongoing when we had a yahrzeit. Sometimes we'd start the Daf Yomi, instead of starting at 7:35, we started at 7:40. You would hear him; he's waiting, waiting by the edge of his seat. And we said, Mr. Sperling, there was a yahrzeit. Somebody gave tikkun. Said, just hold the phone right. We're going to send it to you. We're going to pour you a drink. He loved the kibitzing, and he was really I know it seems hard to believe, but even in these last years, when all we saw of him, besides for the chances we had to visit, was our little white cordless phone that sat there, he was a glue. It was something. It was special. You heard a few words, but we really miss it. We really miss it. It's just not. It's not the same. It's not the same. It's a very, very great privilege to have had him as part of our kehillah, to have had him as part of our lives. I know I speak on behalf of all of us who had the privilege here in the community to have developed this relationship, that his presence was valued and his presence is very much missed.
Thank you very much for coming. Everybody's invited for refreshments out in the hall. Thank you very much.
It's a future for you.
Not for girls, though. We need to express our sides.